Welcome back, everyone. We are now going to move on to our next session that's titled Harming Virtuously Value Alignment for Harmful AI, organized by SRI graduate fellows Michael Zhang, Kelly McConvey, Jamie Duncan, Michael Buvoy, and Silvio Pitis. This session will be moderated by Jamie Duncan, a PhD candidate with the Center for Criminology and Socio-Legal Studies at the University of Toronto. And the floor is all yours, Jamie.
Thanks, Atrisha. So the panelists just want to come on up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. When we were coming up with the idea for this panel, working together across disciplines with computer science and law, information science, we found that a lot of the interdisciplinary discussions that happen with folks here at SRI tend to center around fields like AI safety and AI ethics, and oftentimes these discussions emphasize the need to create autonomous systems that align with human values. And these discussions often assume that human values, whether implicitly or explicitly, mean that AI systems should do no harm to humans. It's like perfect that we came right after the healthcare panel, right? But this understandable, if perhaps idealistic perspective is increasingly confronted by the reality that there are lethal AI systems used for autonomous firearms and drones and potentially far more mundane things like military logistics that are already being used to purposefully harm people. And so this panel asks, how can researchers and practitioners that are interested in the problem of aligning AI with human values address the reality of these purposefully harmful systems? And so with that, I'm really excited to announce the panelists for today's session. With us today, we have Dr. Branka Marijan, who's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, or CG, and a senior researcher at Project Plowshares. She's a lecturer at the Master of Global Affairs program at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy here at the University of Toronto. And Dr. Marijan's research examines concerns regarding the development of autonomous weapon systems and the impact of artificial intelligence and robotics and security provision. Dr. Nisarg Shah is an associate professor of computer science here at the University of Toronto. He's also a research lead for the ethics of AI at the Schwartz Reisman Institute. Professor Shah's research develops theoretical foundations for algorithmic fairness. And finally, Dr. Leah West, who's also a CG senior fellow and an associate professor of international affairs and national security law at the Norm Patterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. Her research focuses on national security law and international humanitarian law, including the applicability of human rights norms in cyber operations. Professor West also served for 10 years in the Canadian Armed Forces as an armored officer. So thank you very much for joining us all today. So before we get kind of into the main discussion, I thought it would be a good idea if you could each just kind of briefly introduce yourself and your background and sort of how you are approaching this topic. Should we start with Dr. Shah?
Thanks everyone for being here. So I work at the intersection of computer science and economics, and particularly in a field called social choice. And social choice thinks about how to make collective decisions that affect all of us together in a way that's fair to all of us. So it thinks about eliciting individual preferences, what we want from those decisions, and then aggregating them in order to arrive at provably fair decisions. So a lot of my research thinks about mathematical criteria for what fairness even means in different application areas, and then designing algorithms that can find those provably fair collective decisions. And my collaborators and I have developed a not-for-profit website, splitit.org, which basically takes a lot of these provably fair algorithms with appealing guarantees from theory and just deploys them onto the platform for everyone to use free of cost. And it's something that more than 250,000 people have used in the last 10 years to make these fair decisions in their everyday lives. And as I've kind of worked on this in very specific application areas, I've also started thinking about the next steps of how to define algorithmic fairness to kind of more broader decision-making paradigms. For example, when ML algorithms output predictions or classifications or recommendations, or even when a large language model outputs a response to a prompt. And it's something that kind of I've thought even more broadly in the context of ethics of AI. So this is what I'm here to hopefully contribute kind of something meaningful about how to think about the ethical reasoning of systems that are designed to impose harm, or whether we can do that, what frameworks exist in the theory to do that. That said, my perspective on this is going to be highly theoretical, and so unlike kind of the other members of the panel, as you heard in their bios, who have very relevant subject expertise on the matter, I'm coming from this from a very theoretical point of view, so I'll be deferring to my esteemed co-panelists on all the practical considerations.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think we're on. Awesome. Thank you so much. As you might imagine, no designers of autonomous weapon systems in the practical sense we're keen to join. But Dr. Marijan, could we ask you to introduce yourself next?
Sure. Thank you so much for this panel. Always a pleasure being here with Leah and with technical experts as well. So over the past 9 years, I've focused on the issues of autonomous weapons and military AI. And I can tell you 9 years ago when I said to people, you know, we really need to be concerned about autonomous weapons, they thought I had a sci-fi problem or was talking about something that was so futuristic that it wasn't going to be an issue. That's certainly changed. This conversation is much easier to have now. So my work basically involves engaging different stakeholders from governments, international diplomats. One of the forums that I've attended for many years, aged prematurely in it, is the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which, you know, diplomacy is slow and it needs to be slow at times, but that forum really takes it up a notch. And so in these discussions, we engage with technical experts, with legal experts, with military experts, and really try and come to a point where we understand what are some shared norms and values, and what are the governance frameworks that, you know, countries could potentially agree to. And because I work for a civil society organization, of course, our focus is on civilian protection and ensuring the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. And so it's interesting in these discussions because civil society, at least I didn't know this until I joined civil society and started working for Plowshares. You know, these are very professionalized individuals who have experience in diplomacy and international affairs. And it was really striking to me how much of an impact these groups have had on this discussion, including by sustaining it. So one of the things, when we're in that room, particularly before that discussion became televised, if we weren't in that room, you wouldn't know what was happening. And sometimes, you know, it's kind of boring stuff, so no one cares, and we have to kind of make it interesting, which we get flack for. Then they're like, oh, you're sensationalizing it. I'm like, do you think anyone will listen to me talk about how long it took for the to be inserted before meaningful or meaningful to be removed from a text? So one of the key roles I see is for individuals such as myself is translating between different worlds. So the technical, the legal, you know, the civil society, the humanitarian, and then the international policy. So I'll leave it at that. I think civil society organizations in this space are critical translators, particularly for the publics of the world.
So I was an operations officer in Kandahar, Afghanistan in 2010, and so my job was basically to manage all of the assets to prosecute the mission. So ISR, which intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, all of the different kinetic tools that we could use, input all of the intelligence, manage the day-to-day. And everything I've done since has kind of been shaped by that experience. So I did a master's in intelligence afterwards because I was like, I was making calls based on intelligence that would like bloop on my screen. I'd be like, okay, we're sending people there. But like had no background in how I came to understand that that was reliable intelligence that we were gonna work on. And then I went to law school after I left the military and, you know, thought I'd do entertainment law and ended up doing national security law and humanitarian law and trying to apply my practical experience to these conversations around things that the people actually writing the law very rarely have experience in from like the operational side of stuff. So trying to take these kind of theoretical or very highly technical legal discussions and mean like, what does that actually mean for the person on the ground? And so this has over the years taken me to talk about things like cyber operations and then biometric use of information and data and big data, because I wrote about data mining back when that was the way we described it, back in 2011. And now it's taken me to a project where I'm working with Branka and CG on responsible use of AI in the military and trying to think about it beyond the killer robots, because a lot of this conversation has, for the last 10 years, really focused on this idea of killer robots, when realistically AI is being used in military systems to prosecute targets in all kinds of ways far beyond the concept of killer robots. So how does the law regulate that is how I'm kind of approaching this question.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We've got some fascinating expertise to draw on today for our panel. And because I think most of the people in this room, and myself included, aren't really sort of experts in this space, could we just maybe start by sort of setting a baseline? And could I ask you each to tell us about sort of what the landscape of purposefully harmful AI systems looks like, and in what kind of military and non-military settings these kinds of tools are being developed with the express intent to harm humans? Should we maybe we can start with Dr. Shah again?
I think they have
okay, sure.
relevant expertise, so I think maybe we should start from there and then.
Yeah, I think Leah started it. I mean, really across the board. So certainly weapons platforms is what you immediately think of. So when we talk about killer robots, we're talking about weapons that can select and engage targets without significant or meaningful, however you want to term it, human input. But AI is used across the board. So from target generation, like how do you come up with targets, to AI decision support systems that allow you to select which weapons to send. So do you respond to this area with a drone or, with a crewed aircraft? Do you respond with a sniper? There's all sorts of systems that countries are onboarding and testing, really. And I think where we see this being tested is in contemporary conflicts like in Ukraine and Gaza. We're seeing the uses of different systems, but these are just, I think, glimpses of systems countries have been developing and working on. And then there are things that are in development, like collaborative munitions. So the munitions themselves can collaborate on targets. Some of these are like DARPA projects, right? And so they don't always, make it into actual production, but you can see everything from the boring stuff, the logistics, the human resource side of it, to the platforms themselves include AI systems. And maybe more specifically, Leah, I can.
Yeah, and I think that, so the question you originally phrased to us was with the express intent of harming people. And I think outside of the armed conflict, there is also context. There are a lot of systems that rely on AI that the express intent may not be to harm people, but that's how they're being used purposefully, right? So the express intent might be for national security or for security purposes, but they end up actually being used against people to harm them, and maybe not in the physical sense of harm, but harming their privacy, their autonomy, psychological harm. So we can talk about AI systems being used for surveillance, for access control, for disinformation campaigns, and they're being used by a wide variety of states to silence, to punish, to deter dissidents, activists, certain ethnic groups, right? So AI has the capacity to harm outside the I intend it to prosecute a target, but is also being used, even if its purpose is designed for safety or security, ultimately to harm people across the world.
Yeah, I would like to echo that. So this dual-use technologies is really a problem because when you kind of frame it as expressly designed to impose harm, that really limits the discussion, because for a lot of technology you can come up with some beneficial use cases. The more interesting question is whether kind of the beneficial use cases outweigh the negative use cases, and how it's actually used in the real world, and what are the dangers versus how significant the benefits are. And so Leah gave a very nice example of for example, the deepfake technology that can be, you can say that this can be used for some, you can generate some beneficial use cases, but if you see kind of today's world, there is a lot more danger of disinformation and misinformation being spread through it. You can have these kind of certain technologies being used by authoritarian regimes for censorship and for kind of suppressing dissent. And there is also kind of there is examples of, for example, worm GPT and fraud GPT, where kind of the people who created these systems, they kind of say that these systems are designed for more freedom, but the use cases can be to design more convincing phishing emails, for example, and if that's the primary use case, then that needs to be factored in. And so kind of I think what the more useful metric is the net harmful or net beneficial AI rather than intently, purposefully harmful AI. And the other thing I want to kind of bring up, and this will become relevant later as we kind of move into the ethics and the reasoning behind it, is that even when a system is not designed for purposeful harm, so for example, a self-driving car, this system might at some point encounter a scenario where it looks at all the possible options, and none of the options that avoid harm altogether are feasible. And at some point it has to make a decision to choose one of the options, and each option is going to impose harm. So even such systems may need in place mechanisms to reason about how to kind of trade off these harms and how to select which kinds of harms are kind of more ethical to impose than other harms. And so whatever kind of ethical principles and frameworks we discussed today would also apply to systems that are not purposefully designed for harm.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for bringing some really excellent nuance to this conversation, because we've got our killer robot, obviously, is the most blatant example of this, but we've got all of these dual use technologies that are far less about maybe the design and more about how people are applying it. And so in this context of both sort of the killer robot and the dual use technology, what does it mean to address this problem of value alignment, or to align these systems with human values in contexts where they can be used, whether purposefully or sort of off-label to cause harm to people?
I'm happy to start off. So a lot of the frameworks that we use for value alignment, so the technical value alignment for AI today actually does apply to some extent to kind of thinking about value alignment for these systems that are going to impose harm. Because as I said, imposing harm is something that's not just a matter of kind of reasoning for systems designed to impose harm. It can come up in other systems as well. So there are already kind of frameworks in place. So we have, for example, hard value alignment, where we prevent, we impose strict constraints on what the AI system is and isn't allowed to do. And I was actually reading up a document called Fundamentals of Canadian Defense Ethics that's published by the Canadian Defense Forces, and this was published back in 2002. So it doesn't talk about AI, but it talks about ethical decision making in the same kind of framework, and it does talk about, for example, the principle of always first trying to find the option of no harm if it's possible. If no harm is not possible, then choosing an option that stays within the international laws of war, that, for example, respects human rights and dignities, so that can rule out certain, for example, torture techniques, right? So these kind of hard constraints are there that people have talked about in the context of ethical decision making in general, and could be applied to AI as well. But I think that there are many situations where these hard constraints do not really apply, or at least we don't have the frameworks available today that these hard constraints apply, and we see kind of a lot of problematic use cases out in the world because of that. And so that's where kind of the soft alignment comes in. And so, for example, the same document from Canadian Defense Forces in that case outlines 6 general principles, things like fairness, accountability, responsibility, honesty, and so on and so forth. And it goes into length to describe what these principles mean. And this is very much in line with this very popular approach called constitutional AI that's being kind of explored nowadays, where you get a set of humans to write down a constitution, some set of principles that the AI should follow, and then you use AI systems to both interpret this constitution and then train against it. But this is kind of, I'm a little bit skeptical personally of this approach, because here it's not really clear to me exactly what interpretation the AI system comes up with of this constitution, and then how it's going to actually embed that constitution inside it. So a more direct approach that's being used for AI alignment today is democratic AI alignment, where you sample a subset of human population and you ask them direct value judgment data. So you basically present them with some hypothetical situations, and then you ask them to make value judgments. And you can kind of imagine this kind of a framework for the kind of scenarios that we are talking about today. But I think it does make some of the challenges even more pronounced. So for example, who are you going to ask for these value judgments? So if it's an AI technology that's being deployed between different nations, are you only going to ask the citizens of one nation, or are you going to ask the citizens of both nations? That could fundamentally change the outcome of what kind of values you get. How are you actually going to elicit these value judgments? This is simple for certain tasks, but when you are thinking about these scenarios where explicit harm is going to be imposed, I think it can be really sensitive to the way the question and the situation is framed. And we see this kind of in the world today. You look at the same conflict from a different point of view, and suddenly people's value judgments change. And then the final question is, how do you actually incorporate all these value judgments into the AI system? And this is where from the theory side of it, and I'll be happy to go into more detail later, we really understand well how to trade off benefits between different kind of individuals and different groups of individuals. But when it comes to kind of trading off harms, even though it might look like just a flipped version where you just kind of negate the benefit and you get harm, suddenly a lot of the same technical questions are actually open and we don't know how to solve them. So.
Yeah, I think one of the key issues in the context that Leah and I, are working on this project in responsible military AI. This is a space where, there's not a lot of room for error. These are safety critical contexts, whether you're considering the safety of the soldiers or the civilians. The safety of civilians. So you have to really, I think, thank you. You have to be sure that the systems that you're using and developing don't just have, value judgments, that they have governance. I'm okay. Sorry, I just got super hot. I'm like, don't want to faint on you here. So we need governance, and we need rules, and we need, norms that are shared by all countries. We cannot have a number of companies decide that this is that their rules are reflected in this particular, system, and then they export that system elsewhere, and the context changes, and it just does not work as well. So that's why I'm a big fan of governance and control, and not so much values. Maybe norms is a better term until we get to the governance. We need norms. But certainly having a governance system in place so that it's clear when, what the limitations are, what the red lines are, and then what happens if harm is committed. Because at the moment we have a big diffusion of responsibility. Everyone says, oh, maybe you hold the coders responsible, maybe you hold the military commander responsible, maybe you hold someone. And when that is sort of the scenario that's given, that means that generally no one's going to be held accountable. So I think when we talk about these values and things, we have a lot of voluntary standards, tech companies like to put out there, but that's not sufficient for the context we're dealing with. I fully recognize maybe in some other contexts that, that this might not be the issue, but in warfare, we need more than just values and norms. We need laws and rules and concrete commitments.
So I teach both law and ethics, and they're not synonyms, shockingly, although some people seem to think that they are, usually lawyers. And I think, so one of the things we will talk about is international humanitarian law. So the laws that govern war are obviously kind of what everyone in the military space looks to constrain the use of autonomous weapon systems, first and foremost. But the thing that I always kind of push back on is that in armed conflict, international human rights law continues to apply, right? It's not supplanted entirely by international humanitarian law, although the United States would disagree. In the international legal context, human rights law, so these fundamental principles that we hold dear, continue to apply even in armed conflict, and that needs to be the baseline. And we are to interpret our humanitarian laws in light of human rights law. And this is really, really important, and part of the discussion I don't think that is sufficient is that AI depends on a shit ton of data to work, right? And whose data is it? It is the data of the people very often who are subject to the conflict. So civilians, right? If you're trying to distinguish friend from foe, you need to collect data on everyone, right? You're not just collecting data on bad guys. And that data lasts beyond the extent of the conflict, right? And so we need to be thinking beyond just the systems itself, but the data that those systems rely on when we're thinking about how to regulate this space. Because I can tell you in the past, in armed conflict, we onboard tools that are deemed mission critical, but very rarely think about the data and the algorithms and everything else that support those tools and what they could be potentially used for and by whom afterwards. So that's another area where I think we need to think beyond existing humanitarian law like talks and think to what are the other human rights implications of creating these tools, creating this pool of data on civilians who happen to live in a conflict zone. And so that's a lot of where I'd like to direct some of our focus, because the harm can persist long after an armed conflict, depending on who has control of that data.
I just want to add one more thing. So I really connected with your point that we need to go beyond just the value judgments and the ethics. So when people think about alignment, they just think about kind of this value judgments. But the one kind of, so if we go take a step back and think about why it is really problematic when AI makes decisions to impose harm as opposed to humans who are currently making the decisions to impose harm, it's not so much as of a concern that AI would end up making an error. We already have seen in a lot of different application areas that AI actually makes fewer errors than humans do. Humans are not kind of not super powerful. They do make errors, and AI actually can make fewer errors. But there are three points that I think make me particularly concerned about AI making these decisions to impose harm. And the first is the speed and the scale at which it can do that. So humans with some of the current technologies, the speed and scale at which they are able to impose harm is limited, and that makes it sometimes possible that if you detect an error, then you can stop it in time, and then you can reverse some of the harm that is done. And this may not be possible with some of the AI technologies that kind of operate at scale. The second thing is the vulnerability, which is where if humans are vulnerable, you can corrupt humans, but every single human that you want to corrupt, you need to invest additional effort. But if you find a backdoor vulnerability onto one platform, suddenly you get control over a host of AI systems, and then you can do much greater harm. So that scale is what's problematic. And the third is the robustness. So I kind of think of AI as a super genius toddler, where it can be much more accurate than humans in some aspects, but when you look at where it actually ends up making the errors, some of those errors are just baffling, right? So you take the image of a dog and kind of, we all know that you change a few pixels and it can classify that image as a bridge. And kind of we are working a lot on the research side to take care of these issues and to make our AI technologies more and more powerful. But the thing is that with more and more powerful technologies, we are only going to resolve the latter two issues, the vulnerability and the robustness issue. These can go away as AI technologies become more powerful, but the speed and scale is only going to get worse. So we may also want to talk about, as we talk about kind of the alignment of these AI systems, we may also want to talk about the need to curtail some of their limitations, their capabilities and their speed and the scale at which they operate before they can ever have the same kind of decision power that humans today have to impose harm.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, all of you. We're going to move into sort of, so I've got some directed questions, and we'll keep an eye on the time, and then save like at least half an hour for audience Q&A. So keep those questions in mind as we come towards that. So Nisarg, actually, you prompted me to move down my list in questions, because I think there's a good segue, and I'll get each of you to answer to this afterwards. We caught this sort of, there's this meanings and methods workshop that we run here at SRI about sort of the different languages that people tend to use to talk about fairly similar things. And we saw one emerge sort of in the conversation that we just had about sort of values and rights and norms. And so Nisarg, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll move down the line. But how do you see theory informing practical systems like this, but in particular, what are the challenges in sort of translating the sort of multifarious perspectives that we have to manage when we're talking about issues like this, and how does that sort of translate into practical applications?
Yeah, so that's a good question. When it comes to kind of, I mean, okay, so on the theory side, there are obviously lots of theoretical questions that as researchers are trying to resolve. But when it comes to taking that theory into the practical action, I think that there are a lot of challenges that we don't have really good answers as to how to resolve. So first and foremost, for example, I mean, there needs to be that bridge between the theory and the practice, right? So that requires meaningful interdisciplinary collaboration between researchers, not just from computer science, but also from philosophy and social sciences and psychology. And so we need collaboration between all these researchers and the engineers and policymakers who are actually in charge of designing and regulating these AI technologies. And this is something that we are seeing more of today, but not to the scale at which would be required for kind of thinking about, say, ethics of warfare systems, right? So that's one challenge. The other challenge is that when it comes to these systems, as my co-panelists have said, the value judgments need to come from a lot of different places, and so there are laws, there are kind of other humanitarian laws and kind of principles that we adhere to, and then there are kind of value judgments that could be directly provided by the society, and it's not clear how to put all of these things together into a single framework and then use that to train the AI system. So these are some of the challenges that are kind of immediately clear, but yeah, I'll let others speak first.
Yeah, I think the geopolitical challenge is great, right? So if you have this, you start with a wonderful commitment, you know, you have systems that you train well, use good data, and you say they're not going to harm civilians, they're not going to go into deeply, you know, into densely populated urban areas, and then war happens and conflicts escalate and systems are used in ways that maybe were unanticipated or fail in different ways. So that's my sort of concern with some of the sort of voluntary commitments, is that that's not sufficient. We need to anticipate some of these scenarios because wars are chaotic, they're dynamic, they shift, they change. They're not technical challenges. They're political challenges, they're people challenges, they're ultimately about people. And so people act in unpredictable ways. And we have to have systems that can anticipate that. And I really like how you use this toddler example, because I think that's what a lot of these systems actually are. They, you know, have some semblance of intelligence, right? They're kind of learning about the world. But you wouldn't let them drive a vehicle. You wouldn't let them near, you wouldn't let them near, you know, anything that moves or does anything.
We both have toddlers.
We have toddlers.
Yeah, same.
We all have toddlers.
We have toddlers. You have to guard them. You have to put parameters around them. You have to anticipate them trying to actively do the thing that you think they're not going to do because they will. And so that becomes a real challenge for technology, right? And now we're talking about warfare, and you have an adversary whose goal is to undermine your systems, right? If technology was the be-all and end-all, I think, you know, outcomes of more recent conflicts would have been a lot different. But it's not, right? War is about more than just technology. And so in those kinds of contexts, I think it's not enough to think about some sort of value alignment, nice sentiments, and, you know, morals and values. It's about understanding, like, what's the realistic outcome of using these systems in these contexts?
So I like to use, I'm going to diagram with my hands. So for me, we talk about ethics, we talk about norms, values, and law. And for me, the law is the outer perimeter of what is possible, right, in an armed conflict. Like, that's as far as you can go. It's the what can we do, it's not the what ought we do question, right? The what ought we do question is the one that is informed by ethics and values and norms. IHL, humanitarian law, should be the outer perimeter. Because you brought up the CAF ethics guide, right? There's nothing in IHL that says you have to act with integrity, honesty, and responsibility. Like, those words don't fall anywhere in humanitarian law, right? ROEs that constrain, so rules of engagement that constrain, even if you're allowed to shoot, when you should or should not, right? Because it's detrimental to the overall mission, right, of what you're trying to accomplish. Even if law says you can, you shouldn't, because it's bad for the mission, right? So I think we need to think about IHL as the perimeter, and then these values and norms as guiding from within there what we accept as something as we ought to do when we're talking about autonomous weapons and autonomous weapon systems. The problem is if there's a gap in IHL, right, that doesn't create that outer norm, then you end up relying entirely on values and ethics, which are non-binding, and they don't have the level of accountability. So that is a concern, right? If there's a little gap where you can reach out of that bubble, and there's debate about whether or not that gap does exist in terms of IHL and autonomous weapons. I think not. I think there is a full circle, but that's not universally accepted, right? And so I think we need to think about these things as a layered approach to how we accept the use of autonomous weapons in armed conflict.
Thanks. Y'all are being really helpful with the segues, because Leah, my next question is exactly about like the laws of war and international humanitarian law. So you say you think that the circle is complete with the law of war, international humanitarian law, potentially human rights. What are some of the gaps that folks are arguing exist in these legal frameworks, and what are the sort of the consequences of those gaps in their perspectives?
So basically, IHL, the fundamental undergirding of it all is to balance the need to bring a conflict to a swift and determinative and efficient end with the principles of humanity, right? Because the point of war is to end the war quickly on your side, right? That's what people are trying to achieve. So to allow that to happen, and because arguably that leads less loss and destruction, versus the principles of humanity. And so they're based on these undergirding principles of distinction, which means you have to distinguish between what is a lawful military objective or a combatant versus civilians and objects which are not lawful targets. So like that is a core principle of distinction. And we see a lot of tools being used to help people like me who are targeters make that distinction. Is that a civilian or is that a combatant? Is that a military facility or is it a civilian facility? Is it something that was once a civilian facility but is now being used as a combatant facility, and vice versa, right? So we're seeing that AI being used a lot in that context. Fully autonomous weapon systems have to make that decision for themselves and then prosecute the target, right? So we are there in certain contexts, but we're not using those weapon systems against humans in populated areas yet. So we're not there yet. Then there's the concept of proportionality, which is tied to this idea of military necessity, right? Is taking out that person, that combatant, or that military objective proportional to any collateral damage that's going to result, right? So it's always this concept of trade-offs, right? If it's pretty easy if you were two ships in the middle of the sea fighting it out, right? Proportionality is like, I'm only taking out a military target, there's no collateral damage, easy assessment. Built up areas where there's lots of civilians, right? Think of the Gaza and Ukraine conflict. Your assessment of proportionality, so what is the direct military advantage I'm gonna get from taking out that target versus the collateral damage, and is it proportionate? So you're always making these assessments, and again, AI is being used, we know, I would argue probably not very well, in Gaza to help people make these proportionality assessments, right? AI is helping them engage in this, what is essentially some like mathematical values estimate that your work would be great at. And then undergirding all of that of distinction, proportionality, and military necessity is accountability, right? Because if there's no accountability for failing to apply those principles, the whole system falls apart. And this seems to be where people have a real problem, is can you be accountable if it's not a human making the assessment of distinction, proportionality, and military necessity? Or if the human doesn't understand the basis upon which those calculations are being made. And that's where a lot of the debate lies in terms of this gap of accountability. Now, me as someone who was a military commander who deployed a lot of resources into the field that I have no idea technically how they work, like don't ask me how a drone flies, like, or how a weapon system, a ballistic missile system works to target, like I don't know how that works. Right? But I understand the consequences of its potential failures, and I make a decision, right, based on all of the information. Even intelligence, I don't know where it came from half the time, right? I'm trusting that intelligence that's being popped up on my screen is reliable and accurate, right? So a military commander is always making these kinds of assessments, and they don't have full understanding of how all of the inputs they're making that decision are. Came to be about, but they then are ultimately wearing it when they decide to execute, deploy the capability and prosecute a target. And so for me, that accountability still works. Even if you don't understand what's going on in the black box, if you're a commander, you choose to deploy an AI asset, whether or not it's to help you make a decision or to actually prosecute a target, you're ultimately accountable. So for me, I see it as a closed loop, and there's a lot of other rules around not using discriminate weapons, not using weapons that can't make good calculations about what is combatant and non-combatant, things that would cause unnecessary suffering because they can't be sufficiently discriminate, that already exist, that put some AI tools just off the table in terms of IHL altogether already.
Awesome, thank you so much. Branka, I think I'd like to turn to you, because we've heard sort of about the accountability and the kinds of decision making that's happening sort of at a tactical level, and I'm wondering what you see the role is for sort of civil society and ordinary citizens to play in the conversations about these kinds of topics.
Yeah, I mean, surprise, I think civil society is critical.
Shocking.
Shocking that I would say that. But yeah, I think civil society and ordinary citizens play an enormous role. I think one of the challenges with these topics is that if you're not a technical expert, you feel like, well, why do I have a voice? Like I'll leave it maybe to the technical experts. And the issue with that, again, like I said, is that these are not technical problems, right? Like we're talking about using this technology to engage in what are ultimately, human activities and what are, political challenges and problems and security challenges and problems. And so it really requires all of us, to be very concerned about how some of this technology is used. In the US, they have this saying, a lot of technology comes stateside, right? So it comes home. So things that you see being used in warfare end up being used in law enforcement, maybe to a lesser degree in Canada. But I think it's still concerning that once we start accepting some of these technologies, we start normalizing certain deployments of violence and uses of violence. And I think Leah made this good point at the outset. In different countries, there are different security considerations. So even for like civil society work, it's a very privileged role to be a civil society representative from Canada, because I don't have to, I can criticize the government, critique them, and then go to a meeting with them, and I don't worry about my safety. In some of the countries that I have colleagues from, like they just disappear, or they face, extremely long conversations at the airport coming back from the UN in Geneva and New York, right? That happens regularly. So those of us who have the voice, the privilege, the ability to, to navigate these topics have an absolute responsibility to do so. Because a lot of, one of the first meetings that I attended at the UN on the topic of autonomous weapons, a representative from a country in Africa stood up and said, these systems are going to be used against people from my country. They're not going to be tested in North America and Western Europe. So we feel like we have a say, and we feel like our voices need to be heard. And that's why Costa Rica and other countries have been really concerned about these technologies and have been calling for prohibitions and regulations, a dual sort of track approach to regulation, because they see themselves as ultimately very vulnerable. And I think that's the reality of this issue, is that there are the haves and the have-nots. In some ways, this technology is democratizing because it gives a number of countries that would not otherwise have certain tools access to these tools, right? But in other ways, there's still a gap. There's a huge technological gap between the countries that have some of the more sophisticated systems and the populations where the systems are being deployed. And you see this asymmetry right now in Gaza, but you will see it in other conflicts. You see it even with drones in parts of Africa that are being used massively to target civilians. So civilians are bearing the brunt of these conflicts. And that's why I think as civilians, we have a duty and a responsibility to speak up about them, to advocate, to navigate this topic, and really keep it front and center.
I want to echo Branka's point. So I do. It has been one of my kind of biggest pain points in AI regulation more generally, that all this regulation is happening, but without any meaningful form of public consultation. So right now, even for example with Bill C-27, right? It's something that a very select group of stakeholders provide input to the government, and then the government moves on to drafting this bill and then revising the bill and hearing on it. So it's something that I'm working with a non-profit AIGS Canada on. We are kind of exploring how we can really get that public consultation into this AI regulation framework. And you are right that these are not issues that non-technical experts cannot understand and cannot have meaningful say in. So we absolutely need to get the public voice in. But at the same time, there are certain kind of ways in which AI technologies operate which are different from how many people view AI technologies, and so at the same time it's also very important that we raise the public awareness, and we run educational seminars. I was at this panel organized by the Toronto Public Library up in York, and there we kind of talked about the dangers of AI technology and the privacy danger, the fairness danger, and how regular people, when they go about their day-to-day life, they many people do not think that these dangers affect them, but these dangers do actually affect their daily life in ways that they don't know yet. So that's really important. And then beyond the public, I think that a lot of the responsibility also lies to the engineers and the developers who actually develop these systems, and where they go in the company, and kind of what kind of work their company is doing, and if they see something that they are concerned about, then whether they have the power and the confidence to be able to raise their voice. So something that I've done here at U of T in collaboration with the Embedded Ethics Education Initiative team over here is to introduce this so-called embedded ethics modules in my courses. So I've done it in 3 of my courses so far, and what these do is that they kind of empower students to think about and reason about the different ethical challenges that can arise in the context of the course content. So they are already learning about how to design certain technologies in the course, and then kind of these modules think about, don't kind of keep the ethics concerns aside. Don't take a separate course on ethics and just forget about it. Think about ethics in your day-to-day life. Whenever you are thinking about designing an AI technology, think about the ethical concerns. And the main point of these modules is to not tell them what ethics is and isn't, but to rather empower them to reason out their own concerns, discuss with their peers, and then be able to voice and articulate their concerns and think about the mitigation strategies. So this is something that kind of we need to empower the next generation of engineers and developers to be able to do.
Amazing. You actually anticipated my next question for you, which was about sort of how you understand the role of your professional community. Do you think there's anything missing in addition to the things that you just kind of outlined?
Yeah, so I mean, so I talked about the kind of the public education. I talked about the education of the students. There is also a kind of on the technical side, there are a lot of problems that I think that we haven't really given a lot of attention to. So Leah said very nicely about the kind of the non-binding, many of these ethical principles, they do not have the binding effect right now, and so that's a real problem. And from a game theory perspective, this actually is a very well-known problem because the reward structure in these cases mirrors something called the prisoner's dilemma, where if you cooperate, if you kind of agree to these principles, but if the other party does not cooperate, then you actually have a lower reward than if you hadn't cooperated, right? So and it's very well known that in this prisoner's dilemma like situation, situation, the rational outcome, quote unquote, is for both parties to defect, and that's the only thing that they can do. But this is something that can be addressed through a different mechanism, different kind of approach called mechanism design, where you actually shift the rewards of the game. So you actually make it more rewarding for somebody to cooperate, to agree to these principles in a binding way. So this requires kind of certain penalties to be built into that agreement, and it requires certain penalties of agreeing being taken out. So there are kind of people discuss trigger mechanisms where the mechanism will only get binding after kind of certain number of parties agree, and so on and so forth. So these kind of I think issues is something that we need to focus more on, and we need to figure out how to make these ethical principles, which are not as binding as the international laws, into kind of binding agreements.
Well, I actually want to pick up on this point of binding here in the prisoner's dilemma, because so international law we can think of as sort of the boundary of what we can do legally, but states have a decent track record of not following the law. So is there a risk of a race to the bottom should, say, one powerful state choose to not to adhere or to differently interpret the law in a way that's sort of potentially harmful to people? I'll open that up to anybody who wants.
Yeah, I think, Leah, and I've said this before, I mean, one of the things that we hear is like, well, we'll agree to it, like we, the West, will be good, we'll agree to these norms, but you know, the Russias and Chinas, they're not going to follow these rules and norms. And we say, well, that leads to a real race to the bottom, right? If you think that, you know, we need to have it because they're going to have it, then where does that end? Where does that take you? And I really like how you call it international law binding. Some of it is binding. Some of it is binding.
More than the ethical principles.
More than the ethical principles. A lot of it is not respected. But I think at least it gives us a framework to function in. And I think the danger if we say, okay, we cannot agree to the norms and rules and laws is that everyone kind of does whatever they want, and we're in a very dangerous situation internationally if countries start using some of these AI systems in their nuclear command and control. You know, we end up in really potentially, like world-ending scenarios because, you know, one of the things, I think it's a joke, but the British Prime Minister, when they asked him, you know, a long time ago what he was afraid of, he said events. And I think that's the reality. I mean, geopolitics is fascinating to study, but the reality is that all of our security is tied to the decisions that are made. And those decisions can really escalate. I don't know if you know the story of Stanislav Petrov, you know, the man who saved the world by doing nothing, but he did something. He trusted his gut. He knew that the software that he had worked on was not ready. He knew if the US had attacked the Soviet Union at that time, that they wouldn't send 5 nuclear weapons, they would send their whole arsenal, right? We have a generation that is growing up with the TikToks and, you know, new technologies, and will they distrust some of these technologies, you know? And that's the concern that we have with this idea that you can somehow program laws into these systems and that we will be okay. I think the reality is that the geopolitical moment that we're living in is quite dangerous. There's not a willingness to agree to any hard laws. There's an enormous competition for AI technologies because these are seen as central to state power among the great powers. And it is within this context that it can be really appealing to say, you know, we have the overmatch, right? The US policy, like no one is even going to think of attacking us because we have the killer robots, we have the latest tools and technologies. And that leads us down a very slippery slope internationally, and really, I think that's the situation we are in currently. Countries see this technology as central to their security. There's a wish to have the latest tools, latest technologies, and deploy them, even though they might not be ready. Even though they're toddlers, they're being sent into you know, conflict zones. And we're leaving humanity to grapple with that, right? To rebuild the societies that are being torn. You know, so many individuals' lives are being lost because some of this technology is being deployed prematurely. And so that's my concern. We're already on this very slippery slope to the race to the bottom.
So law's not going to cut it. There's a reason we have the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. And trust me, it's not based on a foundation of international humanitarian law compliance, right? Like, it's based on the states will not comply, and when they are not compliant and they're faced with an existential threat, how will they behave, right? And it's also not based on ethics either, right? Like, it is a doctrine of deterrence that is based in an understanding that when push comes to shove in certain circumstances, law, norms, ethics will not prevent war. And so there's always that risk. But that doesn't mean, even though we have the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, that is the basis and the foundation of the nuclear arsenals of the United States and the Soviet Union, previously Soviet Union, now Russia, doesn't mean that we still don't also pursue humanitarian law, pursue values, pursue norms, pursue these things. We have to accept that exists, that this is a possibility of human nature, but I also think that we still need to pursue these other avenues to constrain what we believe to be acceptable uses of this technology in armed conflict. And it is a constraining factor. I have the laughing about international law being binding, and there is international really law because everybody finds a way around it even if they don't want to. But if you look at both conflicts that are ongoing right now, right, the perpetrators of the greatest harm are using the language of international law to justify their behavior. So even though they're arguably violating it, it has yet to be conclusively determined in either case of Russia or Israel. Both state leaders are using the language of international humanitarian law to justify their behavior. It still has a constraining force on those states that I think is important and we need to reinforce.
Yes, I would like to echo that. So I agree that kind of international laws are not as binding, but because all these state actors go at length to justify that they are abiding by the laws, I think that it does have certain kind of binding force, and there are penalty mechanisms in place if it is clear that they have violated the law. But the one problem why these laws are not effective today is that they are very, very, very vague. Right, so at the time at which the events are happening, it is impossible to kind of to tell and to make that firm judgment that yes, this law has been violated, and it takes years and years, if not decades, after that to kind of to come to that decision. And that's one of the problems that I've grappled with in my work on fairness as well. You see all these different regulations coming out on AI, including the Bill C-27 and all the different kind of guiding principles that different organizations release. And when you kind of look at the language in there, the language is just very generic. So for example, the language says that your technology should not discriminate between people or between groups of people, and this is something that has existed in the law even before this. So it's not really adding something to it. And then when you pass this law, I'm not sure how much of a binding effect this would have, because when certain companies are going to design that technologies, they are just going to be able to argue that yes, we are complying with the law, we are not discriminating between people, and then it will kind of come to an argument between as to what discrimination really means, and then whether kind of certain definitions of discriminations are being met or not met, and this is going to take a long time to resolve, by which time the harm would have already been imposed. So one thing that I've really advocated is that I understand kind of the need to write the laws and the legal frameworks in a very broad way that captures a lot of different possible cases. But at the same time, I think there is a need for a more kind of mathematically precise criteria that needs to be in place, which can at least rule out certain very obvious harmful scenarios, right? So I think these two things need to go hand in hand. You need to have very kind of generically worded legal frameworks that allow the greatest flexibility in detecting kind of harm, but at the same time, you need very, very precise frameworks that can allow detecting at least very obvious harms as they are happening when they are happening.
Amazing. So I was going to open it up to Q&A, but I think you've just issued a really awesome provocation. So I'm going to give folks a chance to respond to that, and then we'll move to audience Q&A.
Did you want to say?
So I'd push back on and I would put aside domestic legislation from international humanitarian law for a second and just say, yes, part of the problem is that what is proportionate, what is necessary, right? These terms that we apply in assessing whether or not something complies with IHL is in the eye of the beholder. That is true. But they are things that can be and have been assessed by courts with evidence. So it is something that can be done. But like IHL norms have been around as codified law as we think about it for over 150 years. And so they're vague because we apply them in a variety of different contexts to a variety of different techniques. And at the end of the day, what you're assessing isn't whether or not there's a mathematical probability of 100 casualties versus 50, right? If you have that information, you have to make your assessment based on it. But very often in the context of war, you can't be sure. And so I think like if trying to firmly root these kinds of assessments in mathematics is challenging and doesn't provide the flexibility that you need in a context where you need to be able to apply it to a variety of different circumstances using a variety of different techniques. And the other thing I will say is that a lot of the reason why in international law and international agreements you get relatively vague language, even though the goal is always precision, getting buy-in from 100 states, the international community does require compromise, which is why you often have the lack of precision that technologists wish they had, right? Trying to work with an engineer and then being like, so can I do this or not? And I'm like, it depends. Pisses people off, right? But it's really, that's the way laws are drafted because it's about getting compromise. So I think it's always going to be inherent in how we define things at the international level. Should that be the same at the domestic level? I think that the argument is less so. When you're trying to say, like, what does it mean for discrimination in the context of Canadian law? Well, we have definitions of that. Put it in the bill, right? Or like make it very clear for the people who are applying this, or use regulations to allow for updating of bills on a regular basis that use otherwise generic language. So it's a different context, I think, when you're talking about C-27 versus, the Geneva Conventions.
And I think the reality is they start off as these very specific, strong arguments, and then every state in the room literally goes into the Microsoft, Word document and starts changing things. And then, of course, we end up with much weaker language, much weaker documents. But the ultimate goal at the end of the day is something, right? Something that means something, and so you compromise, you negotiate the terms, you push for the strongest possible language, but
that's why you have people in civil society in the room.
What's fascinating about being part of that conversation is just seeing how, words matter, and I think that goes back to that discussion of does IHL really matter, which is, I have this discussion every day with myself and when I teach, does any of it matter? But the IHL thing is, I think, what's important to understand is that if it didn't matter, then why did Russia attend every single autonomous weapons discussion that there has been? And why did they, be very loud and vocal in that? Why are they loud and vocal in this discussion? And why are all these states spending resources and time and staff time and legal, sending their legal representatives to Geneva for these discussions if it doesn't matter, right? So clearly it matters, and civil society is there on the sidelines, on the side events, advocating for stronger language. I think one of the things that maybe isn't as well known about the autonomous weapons discussion is that the civil society effort really started being led off by technical experts who said, we've been asked to work on these systems. We have, moral, ethical concerns. We'd like to advocate. We sent letters to members of our parliament. Nobody responded. So we don't know how to do this. Human rights organizations, humanitarian organizations, can you help us advocate? And that's what's been the strength of this file, is the technical experts really have worked alongside the humanitarian experts. And I do think we need all of those voices and more in these rooms to come up with meaningful legislation, regulation, because one of the challenges with this technology and this issue is that you need to future-proof these regulations. They're painful to get to, the documents, the treaties or the voluntary measures, whatever it looks like. So you don't want it to be irrelevant by the time it's negotiated as well. So that's why we need the technical experts. And the thing about that is also maybe not as well known. I mean, countries have had almost a decade of hearing from technical experts. So technical experts informed us about the way systems can be designed to nudge certain decisions and how would countries deal with that, right? That military commander, if the text that they're getting is in a certain color or a certain font and they, it's just meant for them to approve it, can you really hold that military commander accountable if the system was designed to nudge them to make a particular decision? We've had these discussions. We know what we need, but we don't have political will.
Thanks so much, everyone. Did you want to?
Just that I completely agree, which is why I started with saying that the legal frameworks are right where they are, and there is no way to kind of put the mathematical definitions into the legal frameworks, and they are serving a very good purpose. But at the same time, when you have these developers and designers who are working at these firms, which are designing these AI technologies, when they look at the different guideline principles that are out there and the different legal frameworks that are out there, and they wonder, gee, how do I actually incorporate this? I want to be ethical. I want to design a system that's ethical. How do I incorporate this into my system? There is absolutely no guidance that they have right now, which is why I really like, for example, some of the frameworks of having kind of standards along with the legal frameworks. So for example, in the US, NIST produces, for algorithmic fairness, it produced a standards document, which actually says, here, if you look at kind of this legal specification, then you can relate that to these mathematical definitions that exist in the literature. So that provides some guidance to the engineers and developers that, okay, maybe here is where I should look at in order to kind of figure out how to, on a technical level, make my AI systems more ethical. So that's I think what we need for this the application area of warfare, which is something that currently doesn't exist.
Yeah, and I think this may have been a case of friendly fire. We did not, we did not mean to attack you.
Of course.
And we agree. I think I would say for that myself, we agree that absolutely you need you need what really needs to happen. And this is such a boring political science term, but it's so helpful. Is like a multi-level governance framework, right?
Yeah.
You need it at all levels, and that's something that we need the political buy-in and technical buy-in as well.
Interdisciplinary conversations are hard, and I'm grateful that you're sharing one with us today. But we're going to open it up to the audience. If you're in the room, just do the hand thing, and we've got some folks online, so start stocking up questions there if you would. Maybe we'll go right here.
Thanks. So with apologies, this is just going to be a killer robots question. But, back in October, we started getting news stories that commanders in Ukraine were using fully autonomous attack drones that didn't even have a human in the loop for targeting or firing. And since then, I've been telling my students that was momentous, that was precedent-setting, that was a huge shift, and I've just had these bells going off in my head. Why was this not front-page news around the entire planet? I'm throwing it to you because I'm kind of hoping that I'm missing some nuance or context, and you can reassure me that actually it wasn't as big a deal as it seemed to me it ought to be. Am I missing anything, or was that really a big deal?
So the first sort of big deal killer robot story became the Cargo 2 use in Libya in 2021. UN report came out and said that this was the first use of a killer robot in conflict against a retreating force. And there's all the stories. And then the Turkish company that makes the Cargo 2 said, their advertisement that it can do all these things very autonomously. And then I was at a UN session, virtual at that time because of the pandemic, and the Turkish representative said, this was semi-autonomous. There was still a human making the decisions. So it became this play on language. And then when the stories came out about Ukraine, that again was, we just don't know if these systems are truly functioning autonomously. What we do know is that the possibility and capability is certainly there. But there is a lot of hype in saying that this is a fully autonomous system. So, and then there's also the reality of countries and maybe companies not wanting to disclose that they have certain capabilities. So is it momentous? I think yes, in a way, because it brought people this understanding that these are not futuristic systems. And I think when we started talking about killer robots, a lot of people thought like Terminator, and they wanted, like they had some hyper, like sophisticated system image or a humanoid robot, right? And that was never going to be the case. Like when people said, well, would ask me, like, what does a killer robot look like? I'm like, take any weapons platform, right? And add the software and technical expertise, and you can have a killer robot. So it could be an uncrewed ground vehicle. It could be a sea vessel. It could be, it could be a tank. It could be anything, really. So is it momentous? I think Ukraine in particular is momentous because of the resources that are going into the development and use of military AI in that context. So for that reason, I think it is. As Leah said, like, are these fully autonomous weapons? Are we there yet, where these systems can truly select and engage on their own? I think there's a big question mark hanging around that. Is it possible? Yes. Is it being tested? Yes, and trialed. But the question is, like, how good are these systems? And are we going to see, some sort of leap forward in terms of their use? So I hope that was somewhat of a reassuring answer, maybe. I try being reassuring rather than, I'm not going to be all doomsday today. But yeah, I mean, it's possible, it's being trialed, tested, and used, and we just don't have a whole lot of information about it.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say that this kind of goes back to what Leah said earlier, which is to how do you define meaningful human oversight, right? Because you have systems that require human intervention at very, very different degrees. In one case, you may have kind of a human finally kind of looking at all the information on the screen and then finally making the decision, or you can have kind of the human just specifying kind of the target, but then it's a cruise missile that kind of automatically makes the decisions on the go once the target is inputted, or you can have a human just enter some parameters into the system as to what kind of risks they are willing to take, and then the system automatically makes decisions based on that. I mean, in all of these cases there is some level of human oversight, but whether that's meaningful or not is something that we need to agree on. And I think that this could be actually an easier definitional challenge that for the countries to agree on than some of the other things that we have discussed.
Absolutely.
So I have a question, and so we were talking about the challenges of the principles, regulations, and laws at the level of states, and I just wanted to know your thoughts on the challenges and opportunities of having those laws and regulations at the level of private organizations that we would classify as big tech, because on one hand there are can serve as military contractors, but they also act in a cross-jurisdictional sense, provide AI services in different countries. So what are your thoughts on the challenges and opportunities on them being the target in some sense? Thanks.
So in order to regulate companies, you have to start at the national level. And so you're regulating within the state, right? So this is what we're seeing with C27, right? If you're going to be a company who creates high risk technology, these are the parameters within which you need to play. And there are people advocating for regulations that look more like NIST standards than your typical regulations and that kind of thing. The one thing I will say is that almost all national AI regulation has a carve out for military use. So it doesn't apply, so there's a problem. Well, then what is going to apply to companies who are creating either dual use or military technology. And then this was a 5-year grant proposal I made. What does it mean, right? Like, I don't have an answer for you there, other than to say that the states, there's another element of international law called state responsibility. So if you are using these technologies in a way that violates international law, be it humanitarian law, human rights law, whatever, right? If you're the country using the technology, then you are ultimately responsible for how it's used. And so that behooves the state to regulate or to impose limits on the companies and the technology, et cetera. It doesn't apply to non-state actors, though. So then it becomes about states regulating non-state actors inside their jurisdiction. So like there is a level where all of this kind of feeds in together. But right now, there's this really very obvious gap where even the national regulations is carving out space that's unregulated for military use. So I don't have a good answer for you. I didn't get the CRC, so I'm not pursuing that research, but would like to someday. But yeah, it's a big glaring gap because states don't want to tie their hands on development when it comes to military uses right now.
Yeah, and these companies you probably are better suited to speak to this, but just a quick point that came to my mind. I mean, they're indemnified usually from, any kind of responsibility for what happens with the technology that's used and subsequently. And one of the challenges, though, is that we have companies like Palantir, which are all too willing to go and test their products in other countries. And so, for example, in Ukraine, and you think on the one hand that that's, they want to help the Ukrainians, seems like a good cause. But then, zero responsibility, accountability for how their technology works or doesn't work, and so we have a real problem that this technology is being developed by private companies largely, and governments, like Leah said, they're not as willing to regulate some of that use because they perceive some of the benefits for their own application. But it does leave, it open to abuse by companies who can act in ways that can contravene sometimes national security or even your own strategic kind of aims. So I think there's a big conversation that needs to be had about these private companies because they ultimately have a lot of power. We talk about civil society. Some of these individuals, I mean, they are involved in the highest level of U.S. government, drafting policies, providing advice and suggestions for adopting technologies that, would you be surprised, they have, a stake in. So, we have a very big issue of accountability even at the domestic level with these companies.
Can I just add, there's another difference in today's modern weapons development is that the majority of it is dual use, right? Like no one's developing large language models for military use purposefully, but doesn't mean that large language models that are being deployed to help you write your paper because you're late can't be used in the context of harming individuals. So there's that problem. And that unlike most weapon systems over the course of millennia that have been designed by the state, right? And therefore their design and control has been under the prerogative of the state. That's not the case when we're talking about autonomous support and weapons, right? Because they're dual use, they're often being designed and primarily generated at the outset by companies and not by the state, which is very different than any other time when we're thinking about weapons development.
Yeah, there are weapons that don't look like weapons. So, that's the issue. I'll let you talk. Sorry, it's Leah, but we can get into a discussion.
No, so I completely agree that so when you think about kind of a large language model that is being used, and Palantir has a demo on YouTube where they use a large language model to basically kind of identify and detect and kind of neutralize the target. and it's very scary. So when you have these kind of technologies that were, let's say, designed in academia or in some industry for a completely different purpose and then being reused for such purposes, it really throws a wrench into this like the current regulatory framework, which, as Leah very nicely pointed out, it kind of carves out certain use cases. And in fact, in Canada, it completely carves out the entire public sector use of AI, not just military. So the entire Bill C-27 only applies to private sector use of AI. For public sector, there is a different directive called the Directive on Automated Decision Making, which is already
which
much
also
less.
has a carve out for national
Which
security.
also has a carve out for national security, and it's already kind of much weaker than the Bill C-27, which I think has certain points of weakness itself. So I think these types of kind of frameworks that treat different types of uses differently would just have a problem dealing with these technologies that go across the board. And then the another example that comes to mind is that Anthropic recently released the Claude 3 Opus, and it's a very powerful LLM, and they UK's AI Safety Institute was expecting that because they have kind of specified this, they were expecting some access to a pre-deployment testing window during which they can test and they can make sure that this platform is safe, and they did not get that access, and then the model was deployed, and then they kind of raised concerns about it, and then Anthropic's response was basically that well, pre-deployment testing is a good idea, but it doesn't really work in practice. Then kind of Meta had a very similar response that we are an American company and we are not going to be governed by kind of other countries' regulations. So it's something that I think is actively being worked on. There are kind of US and UK are from what I understand are kind of in conversations to kind of make this inter-country regulations and oversight happen, but it's something that I think is going to take some time to see.
Okay. Yeah, hi. I'm Igor, and I'm a faculty actually in robotics and autonomous systems. And some of the work that my research has produced, not my personal, but indirectly, was definitely dual use, and it got used much faster. At least the type of technologies got used much faster in military applications than any of us would like to admit. So a lot of what you guys have said resonated with me a lot, particularly because professors like to say we don't want to harm or replace humans, we want to augment them. But the reality is that technology does also harm and does also replace humans. In spite of it all resonating with me, I want to ask now the positive case question. Mm-hmm. What do you guys think is, from a regulatory perspective and also from a legal perspective, the case for where we should mandate AI systems to make the decisions rather than humans? Mm-hmm. The classical case of weapons industry is that AI systems do not commit war crimes, mm-hmm. and it's much easier to lock everything. So if a human decision maker in the loop, a remote operator such as yourself makes a wrong decision, it will be stored and it's not on the battlefield just happening. So yeah, but what is the discussion in that space, and what are your guys' thoughts?
Yeah, so there are people making the counterpoint, right? That humans are flawed. You're in a war zone that is, they call it the fog of war for a reason, and you're being given all of these inputs while your own life or the lives of people that you care about is in jeopardy. You're going to make mistakes in a way that maybe a machine won't, right? And so making that proportionality assessment, right? If the proportionality assessment is the loss of lives of your own troops, right, versus the loss of lives of civilians, are you going to make a true proportionality assessment, right? Or should you be relying on something that is more objective, right? Are you really that good at making a decision about whether or not something is a military objective, right? A lot of people make the argument that machines are not well placed to make it, or AI is not well placed to make a decision about whether or not someone is hors de combat. So when somebody is no longer a target, right? They've taken themselves off the battlefield. But I mean, human bias is real, right? We'll see things we want to see. So should we be also relying on the judgment of something that is presumably, hopefully, less biased than the human facing life and death consequences, right? And so I think that there are real opportunities to rely on AI is another source of intelligence. Like I use facial recognition technology in some of my papers to argue, like, if you're trying to decide between somebody in a group of whether or not they are that bad guy that you know is a bad guy or not, right? And you're trying to look at a picture and look at them and make the decision, right? Like facial recognition technology is probably, depending on the circumstances, going to be better than your own two eyeballs. So, especially if you're looking at them through a drone, right? So there are use cases that I think do make, allow us to do less harm, to be more discriminate, more discrete, and more proportionate in our assessments. But it's also in how those things are programmed. Like my argument about, we're seeing this technology being deployed in Gaza right now, and where is their proportionality assessment set, right? And whether or not something is a military objective once makes it a military objective forever. Like I don't know how that's being programmed into the technology and the tools that they're using to help them make these decisions. So like, just because it can be more objective, it also depends on the parameters you're putting into them. And so like it's complicated, but I do think that there's use cases for it that would make it, allow us to be more discrete and discriminate, but you have to, it all depends on how it's programmed at the end of the day, and then ultimately whether you rely on it.
I wonder if I can take a minute just to ask you guys two questions. One, if you had to deploy human soldiers or autonomous robotic systems, how many of you would rather deploy human soldiers? Okay, how many of you would rather deploy robotic systems? What do you guys think? Would you rather deploy humans or robots? Who thinks humans? The sons and daughters of your community, let me put it like that. Okay, how many of you would deploy robots if you had the choice, right?
Depends on the application.
Okay, now let me flip the question for you. How many of you would rather face a human soldier versus a robot? Okay, if you had to face, you're in a conflict zone, you had to face a human soldier or an autonomous weapon system, would you rather face a human soldier? Put your hand up. Okay, and how many of you would rather face the robots? Yeah, a few, right? So, but I think generally people understand that there's something about humanity, right, that we cannot program into robotic systems. And some of you are, technical experts. You're more comfortable with robotic systems, but generally we all see this sense of humanity that we hope, and we know humans make mistakes. We know humans commit terrible war crimes against each other. But I think there's also a sense of humanity, or, where humans don't like shooting at each other. We find some conflict zones, right? And so there's a need for dehumanization, et cetera, that needs to happen. And so that's something to keep in mind, right? These are not hypothetical scenarios for a lot of people coming, looking at future conflict. These are going to be real scenarios.
Yes, I'm glad you raised this point, because there are a number of contexts where AI is deployed. Let's talk about outside of warfare. So some of the examples from my field, for example, is that AI is used in New York City and Boston to match students to schools, and to match residents to hospitals. And so these are, and for example, in participatory budgeting, which is an application where cities decide how to allocate public budget to different infrastructure projects based on the residents' votes. And this is something where AI can actually remove some of the biases, as we have discussed, and these biases existed, and it's well documented that AI actually came in and kind of made everything more transparent. One of the benefits of AI is that, unlike a human, for example, a human judge, where you can kind of ask the judge why they made certain decision, and then they can make up any story about it. With AI, you can kind of, in some sense it's black box, but in other senses it's very transparent. You can actually run the AI system on hypothetical scenarios. You can see what the AI system would have done. It's something that we don't have the flexibility of doing with humans. And I agree that there is a sense in which kind of humanity, I mean, most of us, I think, are like that, at least most of us in this room. But I don't know, when it comes to kind of facing a human soldier, sometimes it can be a difficult decision because you don't know what biases go into the minds of that person and how they are going to see, for example, certain racial groups, how they are going to see certain gender minority groups, how they are going to see groups of certain ethnicities. And so it's something that I think can be very, very, a lot of people can be very distrusting of human soldiers because of that.
One response to the either or question is neither.
Yep.
And from the online questions, another question that came up is, I'm interested to know from the panel how they see connections to moral education in their work. I know Nisarg mentioned the ethics initiative, and where do they think moral education should be taught? And like how generally, as a normal citizen, how do you stay informed or when it seems like a daunting thing to tackle?
So I'll just, from the profession of arms perspective, so I'll talk about the soldier, right? You're not just taught the law, you're not just taught about that outer perimeter. There is an ethos to being a professional soldier in a professional army, right? This is the context that I'm talking about. And so that imbues in you considerations of not just the can, but the ought. And allows you to be more flexible in a scenario where, you know, you're in Afghanistan and someone's coming at you in a car and you know you can shoot at it, but you think you see kids in it and you don't know whether or not you should and you decide not to, right? But you had full right to pull the trigger, right? And so these are the types of things that are tricky when you're talking about AI systems, right? Because if it was just an automated weapon, would it have pulled the trigger? Probably, right? Like, and so it's that like ethos about, I may lose my life in this scenario, but I volunteered as a professional soldier to put myself in this scenario and make these kinds of choices and potentially sacrifice my life. But I'm going to choose that over potentially killing an innocent person. That I think is really, really important. And I think needs to continue to guide how we train commanders to think about the deployment of AI. Like that shouldn't go away just because we're relying on machines more and more. And so I think reinforcing that professional ethics within the military or the profession of arms is really, really important.
I teach this class at the monk school, and I see it as being really critical to train the next generation of, you know, policy makers about these issues and to empower them to really think about the fact that they may not be technical experts, but they can understand the issues more broadly. And one anecdote I can tell you is that every class, you know, when I start and I talk about targeting, they're like, you mean like ad targeting, right? And I'm like, no. This class, like this class is, you know, targeting, like killing target. And they're like, oh, okay. And so it becomes a really different discussion about the technical aspects, because sometimes this technology can sanitize, you know, warfare and sanitize language. Even when we talk about targeting and AI, you know, target generation, we're talking about finding people to kill, right? And I think it's really critical that we don't do that we don't sanitize it, that we are very clear, so that the sort of soldiers who bear the sort of responsibility in the decision making, you know, that they understand that, but that the policymakers understand that too, right? Because in democratic societies, at least, there's input, you know, on where the soldiers go and what sort of wars are entered into. And I think that that's really critical. We need thoughtful publics, and we need thoughtful policymakers as well.
So to end on a dark note, unfortunately, we're at time, but thank you so much for sharing in this really important conversation, even if it's not always super comfortable. So I really appreciate all of y'all for being here and everyone for participating.